3.4 billion people. That's how many people live in countries that spend more on debt interest than on health or education combined. 3.4 billion. But here's what nobody's telling you. This isn't an accident. This is by design. In 2024, developing countries paid a record $415 billion in interest alone. Not paying off debt, just interest. That's more money than flows through most nations' entire economies. Let me show you exactly what's really happening. July 1944. World War II is still raging across Europe and the Pacific. But in a secluded hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, something else is happening. 44 nations are gathering to decide the future of global finance, and what they're creating will shape power structures for the next 80 years. Here's the key. This wasn't about helping nations rebuild after the war. Not really. Two men are in the room, Harry Dexter White from the US Treasury and John Maynard Keynes from Britain. They're both proposing competing visions for the post-war economy. But only one vision wins, the American one. They create two institutions, the International Monetary Fund and what becomes the World Bank. And right from the start, they build in a mechanism that sounds reasonable, but is absolutely devastating. It's called weighted voting. Here's what nobody tells you about weighted voting. Every country gets a vote, sure, but your vote is tied to how much money you put in. The United States immediately controls 17% of all votes at the IMF. 17%. And for major decisions, you need 85% approval. Do the math. The United States gets veto power over everything that matters. One country. Veto power. 80 years later, they still have it. But it gets worse. Let me show you something. There's this informal agreement. They call it the Gentleman's Agreement. The United States gets to pick the World Bank president. Europe gets to pick the IMF managing director. Every single World Bank president in history has been American. Every single one. Not because Americans are uniquely qualified, because of a backroom deal made in 1944. Now here's where it gets really dark. Fast forward to the 1980s. Developing countries are drowning in debt. Oil prices have exploded. Interest rates in the US have skyrocketed. Countries can't pay. So the IMF shows up with a solution. They call them structural adjustment programs, SAPs for short. And they sound reasonable at first. We'll lend you money to get through this crisis. Just make a few reforms. Here's the key. Those reforms aren't neutral. They're not about helping your economy. They're about opening your economy to Western corporations and ensuring you keep paying creditors. The pattern repeats in country after country. Cut government spending, especially healthcare and education. Privatize your state-owned industries. Sell them to foreign corporations, usually at bargain prices. Devalue your currency. Remove barriers to foreign investment. Cut subsidies for food and fuel. Let me show you what this looks like in reality. In Zimbabwe, SAPs led to increased poverty and economic collapse instead of growth. In Ghana, they were forced to devalue their currency and flood the market with cheap goods. But everyone else was doing the same thing. The market was already flooded. They gained nothing. Here's what nobody tells you. For 36 countries that received 10 or more adjustment loans between 1980 and 1998, the median growth rate of income per person was zero. Zero. 2 decades of structural adjustment. Zero growth. But the debt kept growing. Interest kept accumulating. And the IMF kept lending. Why? Because this wasn't about development. This was about control. Now look at Toda. Right now, 2024, the numbers are absolutely staggering. Global public debt has hit $102 trillion. $102 trillion. Developing countries owe $31 trillion of that, and their debt is growing twice as fast as wealthy countries' debt. Twice as fast. Here's the key. Developing countries paid $921 billion in interest payments in 2024. Nearly $1 trillion. That's a 10% increase from just the year before. And 61 countries now spend more than 10% of all government revenue just on interest payments. Think about what that means. Schools closing, hospitals underfunded, infrastructure crumbling. Not because these countries are poorly managed, because they're trapped in a system designed to extract wealth. Let me show you the voting structure today. Africa has 54 member countries in the IMF. the entire continent of Africa. They have 326,000 votes combined. North America has two countries. Two, the US and Canada. They have 943,000 votes, nearly 3 times as many votes for two countries versus 54. But here's what they don't want you to know. It's gotten worse. Since 2020, developing countries have been borrowing at rates 2 to 4 times higher than the United States. 2 to 4 times higher for the same money. In 2024, the average interest rate developing countries pay to official creditors hit a 24-year high. To private creditors, a 17-year high. The poorest countries are paying the highest rates in a generation. So who benefits from all this? Follow the money. When the IMF forces countries to privatize state industries, who buys them? Western corporations. When they force currency devaluation, who profits? Foreign investors who can buy assets cheap. When they force cuts to social programs, who suffers? The people, not the elites, never the elites. Here's what nobody tells you about so-called bailouts. In 2023, private creditors received $13 billion more from poor countries than they gave in new loans. $13 billion more out than in. Meanwhile, the World Bank and multilateral institutions had to pump in $51 billion to keep these countries afloat. The private sector extracts wealth. The public sector, funded by taxpayers, bails out the system. You're subsidizing corporate profits through your tax dollars. But it gets even more insidious. Let me show you something about the World Bank president. Right now, the president is Ajay Banga, former CEO of MasterCard. Before that, they appointed David Malpass, a climate change skeptic who opposed sharing COVID vaccine technology. Before that, Jim Yong Kim. Before that, Robert Zoellick, a former Goldman Sachs executive. Do you see the pattern? These aren't development experts. They're corporate executives and Wall Street insiders. They're not there to end poverty. They're there to manage the system that creates it. Now here's where it all comes together. The IMF and World Bank operate with something called conditionality. You want a loan, you have to meet our conditions. And those conditions are always the same formula. Austerity, privatization, deregulation, market access for foreign corporations. It's the Washington Consensus, wrapped in development language. Here's the key. They renamed these programs. The structural adjustment programs got too much criticism in the 90s. People were catching on. So they created the Enhanced Structural Adjustment Facility. Then the Poverty Reduction and Growth Facility. New names, same policies, same results. Recent studies show modern IMF programs lead to increased poverty and more unequal income distribution, just like the old SAPs. They rebranded the poison and kept selling it. But here's what they don't want you to know. There are success stories of countries that ignored this formula. South Korea, China. They built their economies through government intervention, industrial policy, and strategic trade protection. Everything the IMF says not to do. And they succeeded massively, while countries that followed IMF prescriptions stayed poor or got poorer. Let me show you the voting power dynamic one more time, because this is crucial. The G77 countries control 43% of IMF votes. They're 4% of the membership, 43% of the power. The entire global south, billions of people, are essentially locked out of real decision-making. And anytime there's talk of reform, anytime countries like China say their voting power should reflect their actual economic size, the United States blocks it. Because if China's voting share matched its economic weight, the US would lose its veto. And they will never let that happen. Let's talk about what this means for actual people, real lives, not just numbers on a spreadsheet. In the 22 most heavily indebted countries, where external debt exceeds 200% of export revenue, an average of 56% of the population cannot afford the minimum daily diet necessary for long-term health. More than half the population. Malnutrition, stunted growth in children, preventable diseases. Here's what nobody tells you. This is happening while these countries are transferring billions in interest payments to creditors in wealthy nations. They're starving while paying banks. In Kenya, deadly protests erupted when the government tried to raise taxes to deal with a debt crisis where interest payments absorbed almost 60% of total government revenues. People died in the streets, fighting against debt servicing. 3.4 billion people live in countries spending more on interest than on health or education. That's nearly half the world's population. Half the world trapped in a system where debt payments matter more than human development. And the IMF's response? More of the same. More conditionality, more austerity, more privatization. Here's the key. They even tried to greenwash it. They created a resilience and sustainability facility for climate lending. Sounds great, right? But there's a catch. You can only access it if you have a regular IMF loan with standard austerity conditions. So even climate finance comes with the same poison pill. Let me show you exactly how the power structure works right now, today. The United States controls 16.41% of World Bank votes and about 17% of IMF votes. That's enough to veto any major decision. The only country with that power, Japan, Germany, France, and the UK, also appoint their own executive directors. These 5 countries, 5 hold more power than 180 plus other nations combined. But here's what they don't want you to know. This structure was designed for 1944, when Europe was in ruins, when most of the developing world was still colonized, when the US controlled 2/3 of global gold reserves. That world doesn't exist anymore. China is the world's 2nd largest economy. India has massive economic weight. The entire power structure is a fossil from a world that died 70 years ago. But they won't change it, because change means giving up control. And control is the whole point. Here's the key. Every few years, there's talk of quota reform, redistributing voting shares to reflect modern economic reality. And every time, it gets blocked. In 2014, blocked. In 2023, blocked. The pattern never changes because the system works exactly as intended for those in control. So here's what you need to understand. This isn't a conspiracy theory. These are documented facts, public records, official statistics. The IMF and World Bank were designed by wealthy nations to maintain economic control after World War II. They operate through weighted voting that gives veto power to the United States. They impose conditions that benefit Western corporations while claiming to promote development. And they've trapped billions of people in cycles of debt that extract more wealth than they provide. The debt crisis isn't a crisis for everyone. For creditors, for banks, for the financial system, it's working perfectly. It's only a crisis for the people paying. 3.4 billion people spending more on debt interest than on health or education. Countries choosing between feeding their people and paying foreign banks, a system where 80-year-old power structures dictate policy to sovereign nations. This is the hidden history of the IMF and World Bank, not development institutions, control mechanisms designed to maintain the economic order established in 1944 when the powerful decided how the world would work. And until we understand this, until enough people see the system for what it really is, nothing will change. The debt will keep growing, the interest will keep accumulating, and billions will keep paying for a system designed to keep them paying. That's the real story. That's what they don't want you to know.